In June 2024, a man stood in a Florida courtroom with a permanent tattooed grin carved into his skin, facing the ultimate price for a week of pure carnage. He shares a name with one of the world's most famous anti-heroes, but Wade Wilson is no fictional protagonist. Behind the ink of swastikas and the stitches across his mouth lies a human void that swallowed the lives of two innocent women in 2019. This is the reality of a monster who didn't just kill, he erased humanity with a smile. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot, thank you. To understand the man who would eventually be known by the moniker of a comic book mercenary, we have to go back to the quiet, humid stretches of Tallahassee, Florida. The story of Wade Stephen Wilson doesn't begin with violence, but with a search for belonging. A search that was supposed to end when he was just an infant. Born in May 1994, Wade was adopted into the Testaceka family, a household that provided the kind of stability and middle-class comfort that many would consider a blueprint for a successful life. His adoptive parents, Stephen and Mary Testaceka, opened their home and their hearts to a boy they hoped would grow into a man of character. But as the years unfolded under the blistering Florida sun, it became clear that something within Wade was fundamentally out of alignment. In his early years, long before the ink began to swallow his features, Wade was, to the casual observer, a relatively ordinary child. However, those closest to him began to notice the subtle fracturing of his personality. His father would later describe a son who seemed to exist behind a glass wall, present in body, but emotionally unreachable. There were the typical childhood outbursts, but they were tinged with a level of intensity that suggested a deeper, more turbulent internal weather. By the time he reached his teenage years, the cracks in the foundation were no longer subtle, they were structural. The transition from a troubled boy to a career criminal happened with a jarring, rhythmic regularity. His school years were defined more by his absences and altercations than by his academic achievements. He eventually walked away from the traditional path of education, choosing instead a life dictated by the immediate gratification of the streets. His early 20s were a revolving door of county jails and short-lived freedom, a cycle of burglary, grand theft, and battery that hinted at a growing comfort with physical confrontation. But it was his physical transformation that served as the most visceral evidence of his psychological departure from society. It began slowly, a few pieces of ink on his arms, common enough in the humid gyms where he spent his time sculpting a massive, imposing physique. But the tattoos soon migrated, moving upward toward his neck, and eventually claiming his face as a canvas for a very specific kind of darkness. He didn't just get tattoos, he underwent a metamorphosis. He carved a stitched smile across his cheeks, an homage to the chaos of the Joker that signaled a permanent break from the Wade the Testacekas had tried to raise. Swastikas and pagan symbols began to populate his skin. Marks he would later claim were chosen simply because they were scary, a deliberate attempt to project a monster before he had even fully become one. The man who walked into the fall of 2019 was a walking paradox, a bodybuilder with the strength of an elite athlete and a face that looked like a nightmare brought to life. He had spent years drifting, moving between Tallahassee and the coastal cities of Florida, leaving a trail of broken relationships and concerned family members in his wake. His adoptive father, Stephen, watched from a distance as his son's identity was replaced by this ink-covered shell. He noted that Wade had become a master of manipulation, capable of turning on a superficial charm that belied the hollow space where his empathy should have been. By the age of 25, Wade Wilson had become a ghost in his own life. He had no permanent address, no steady career, and no allegiance to anyone but his own impulses. He was a man who felt nothing, and in that void, a dangerous pressure was building. He wasn't just a criminal, he was a predator who had spent a lifetime practicing the art of taking what he wanted. As October 2019 approached, the temperature in Southwest Florida remained high, but a cold, calculated darkness was about to descend on the city of Cape Coral. The boy who was given every chance to thrive had finally decided to embrace the role he had been tattooing onto his skin for years. He was no longer just Wade. He was a storm waiting for a reason to break, and that reason was waiting in a bar on a Friday night. The psychological profile of Wilson during this period is a study in clinical detachment. Medical experts would later debate the presence of bipolar disorder and the long-term effects of potential brain injuries. But to those who encountered him in the wild, he was simply a force of nature that lacked a moral compass. He moved through the world with the confidence of a man who knew he could overpower almost anyone, and the face of a man who didn't care who saw him do it. This was the biography of a man who had spent 25 years erasing himself, only to fill the empty space with something far more terrifying. The venue for this fateful collision of lives was Buddha Live, a local bar on McGregor Boulevard that served as a sanctuary for the neighborhood. Inside, the bass of the music thrummed against the sternum, a physical reminder of the night's momentum. The floor was worn smooth by decades of dancers, and the air carried the heavy, sweet scent of humidity mixed with the sharp, clinical tang of sanitizer. Christine was there with her friend, Samantha, two women moving through the crowd, entirely unaware that the orbit of a predator was about to intersect with their own. Wade Wilson did not enter a room so much as he occupied it. Standing at a towering 6'6", his massive frame was a testament to a life spent in the pursuit of physical dominance. But it was his face that truly arrested the attention of the patrons, a landscape of dark ink, swastikas, and that chilling, tattooed, stitched smile. He was a visual manifestation of a society's deepest fears. Yet, when he approached Christine, he didn't radiate hostility. He radiated a calculated, magnetic stillness. He possessed a charisma that was as thick and suffocating as the Florida air, a way of leaning into a conversation that made the person he was talking to feel like the only inhabitant of the universe. As the drinks flowed, mostly mixed cocktails and the occasional beer, the interaction between Wade and Christine took on a life of its own. He told her that he was a man of diverse interests, a drifter who found beauty in the unconventional and the overlooked. He spoke about his tattoos not as symbols of aggression, but as artistic expressions of his internal turmoil. He was a master of the misunderstood soul narrative, a role he had perfected over years of manipulation in jails and on the streets. He told Christine and Samantha that he was just looking for a chance to relax and forget the weight of the world for a few hours. Christine was captivated. She saw past the ink and the looming shadow. She saw a man who seemed to be searching for a connection in a world that had rejected him. In her mind, the tattoos were likely just a mask, a defense mechanism for a man who had seen too much. She laughed at his jokes and matched his energy, her natural warmth providing a sharp contrast to the cold, ink-stained features of the man sitting across from her. They shared stories about their lives in Florida, the kind of superficial exchange that usually precedes a fleeting friendship. But for Wade, this was a hunt. He was observing her every reaction, noting the way she leaned in, the way she trusted him almost immediately. He later admitted to investigators that he found her easy to talk to, but that ease wasn't born of affection. It was born of her vulnerability. He liked that she wasn't afraid of him. To a man with his psychological makeup, a lack of fear was not a comfort. It was an invitation. It was a challenge to see how far he could push before the terror finally set in. As the clock ticked toward the early hours of Monday morning, the group decided to leave the bar. The transition from the loud, crowded interior of Buddha Live to the quiet, dark streets of Fort Myers was jarring. The heat was still there, a persistent reminder of the tropical latitude. They moved as a trio, Christine, Wade, and Samantha, making their way to Christine's home in Cape Coral. The drive was a blur of streetlights and darkened strip malls. The hum of the tires against the pavement, the only sound in the humid cabin of the car. Cape Coral is a city defined by its water, a labyrinth of over 400 miles of canals that wind through the residential neighborhoods like the veins of a giant organism. It is a place that usually feels safe, a quiet suburb where the only sounds at night are the rustle of the palms and the occasional splash of a fish in the brackish water. Christine's house was a modest, well-kept home, a sanctuary where she felt secure. She invited Wade and Samantha inside, the hospitality of the evening continuing into the pre-dawn hours. Inside the house, the atmosphere shifted. The energy of the bar had faded. replaced by the intimate, low-light reality of a private residence. They sat in the living room, the air conditioning humming a steady, mechanical lullaby against the silence. They continued to talk, but the conversation grew more subdued. Wade's presence in the small space felt even more immense. His height nearly reaching the ceiling, his tattooed features casting long, distorted shadows against the walls. Samantha, eventually feeling the weight of the late hour, decided it was time for her to head to her own home, leaving Wade and Christine alone. As the door clicked shut behind Samantha, a finality descended upon the house. The safety of the crowd was gone. The witness was gone. Christine, still under the spell of the night's excitement and the charm Wade had so carefully curated, felt no alarm. She saw a man who had been a gentleman all evening, someone who had listened to her and made her laugh. She didn't see the predator who was already beginning to detach from the persona he had been wearing for the last 5 hours. Wade stood in the middle of her living room, his eyes scanning the space. He wasn't looking at the decor or the photos on the mantle. He was looking for exits. He was looking for obstacles. He told her that he was tired, that he appreciated her opening her home to him. The words were polite, but the voice was flatter now, more monotone. The mask was beginning to slip, not into a look of rage, but into a look of absolute, chilling indifference. The house was quiet now. The only sound was the distant chime of a neighbor's wind chimes and the steady drip of a faucet. The Florida night was at its darkest, the hour when the line between a pleasant memory and a waking nightmare begins to blur. Christine Melton went to sleep that night, believing she had made a new friend. She had no way of knowing that the man she had invited into her sanctuary was a man who had spent his entire life preparing for the moment when he would finally let the monster out. The Deadpool killer was no longer a name or a costume. He was a 6'6" reality sitting in her living room, waiting for the sun to never rise for her again. As the first faint light of October 7th began to bleed into the horizon, the interior of Christine Melton's home in Cape Coral remained a tomb of artificial coolness. The air conditioner hummed, a steady, mechanical drone that filled the silence of the bedroom. Christine lay in a deep, undisturbed sleep, the kind of heavy slumber that follows a night of social exertion and the warmth of a new connection. Beside her, Wade Wilson sat in the shadows. He wasn't sleeping. He was vibrating with a cold, predatory frequency. He later told investigators that there was no argument, no sudden flash of rage that prompted what happened next. He simply looked at the woman who had opened her home to him and decided that her life was a luxury he was no longer willing to permit. He leaned over her, his massive 6'6" frame casting a distorted ink-black shadow against the headboard. His hands, sculpted by years of heavy lifting and covered in the dark iconography of his own design, found their way to her throat. The physical disparity was staggering when his fingers closed around her neck. The silence of the room was shattered by the frantic, reflexive struggle of a human being realizing their air has been cut off. Christine's eyes snapped open, but she didn't find the misunderstood man from the bar. She found the void. She clawed at his forearms, her nails scraping against the tattooed swastikas and the stitches on his skin. But Wade was an immovable object. He didn't look away. He didn't blink. He maintained the pressure with a clinical, terrifying consistency, watching as the life force drained out of her. When the struggling finally stopped, he didn't immediately let go. He held her there, ensuring the stillness was permanent, before finally withdrawing his hands. The aftermath was not marked by panic, but by a chillingly mundane series of actions. Wade didn't flee into the night. He lingered. He took the keys to Christine's car, a blue Nissan Altima, and walked out of the house as if he were merely leaving for work. He drove away, the stolen engine purring through the quiet residential streets of Cape Coral. The sun was up now, the Florida heat beginning to bake the asphalt. Most people were starting their Mondays, pouring coffee, checking emails, unaware that a monster was navigating their morning commute. By the time Wade reached a different part of the city, his pulse was likely racing with the high of his first kill. He was a shark in a suburban sea. That's when he saw her. Diane Ruiz, 43 years old, a mother who worked 2 jobs to keep her family afloat. She was walking to work at the Moose Lodge because her own car was in the shop. She was walking along a stretch of Pine Island Road, a mundane journey she had made many times before. She was a woman of routine, a pillar of her community. And to Wade Wilson, she was simply the next opportunity. He rolled the Nissan Altima to a stop beside her. The window slid down with a soft, electric hiss. He leaned across the passenger seat, using that same magnetic, manipulative charm that had worked so well just hours before. He asked for directions, a simple, harmless request that preyed on Diane's innate helpfulness. She leaned toward the car, her mind likely on her shift and the tasks ahead. In one fluid, violent motion, Wade reached out and dragged her into the vehicle. The interior of the Nissan became a cage of violence. Diane didn't go quietly. She fought with the ferocity of a mother who knew she had everything to lose. She screamed. She kicked at the dashboard. She tried to lunge for the door handle, but Wade's strength was a wall she couldn't break. Inside the cramped cabin, the smell of old upholstery and stale air was punctuated by the sharp, metallic scent of fear. Wade told her to be quiet. He told her he just wanted to talk, but his hands were already moving toward her neck. He strangled her right there in the car. His massive frame pinned her against the seat as he squeezed. He felt her go limp, but he could still feel the stubborn, faint rhythm of her heart. She wasn't dead. Not yet. And for Wade, that wasn't enough. He drove toward a secluded, wooded area, a stretch of undeveloped land where the prying eyes of the city were replaced by tall weeds and the shadows of the palms. He stopped the car and pushed Diane's unconscious body out onto the dirt. The ground was dry, the dust kicking up around her as she lay there, gasping for the air he had stolen from her lungs. Wade got back behind the wheel. He later described this moment to his father with a lack of remorse that would eventually sicken the entire state of Florida. He didn't just want her to stop breathing, he wanted to destroy the vessel entirely. He shifted the Nissan into gear. He backed the car up, the engine revving, and then he floored it. The tires bit into the dirt, and then they hit something solid. He drove over her. Then he shifted into reverse and did it again. He repeated this cycle, driving forward and backward 10, 15, 20 times. He told his father later that he kept going until she looked like spaghetti. The sound was a wet, sickening crunch, a physical erasure of a human life. When he was finished, he didn't bury her. He didn't hide the evidence. He simply left her there in the weeds, a discarded piece of humanity, and drove away in a car that didn't belong to him, stained with the blood of two women who had done nothing but exist in his path. The heat of the afternoon was now at its peak. The humidity was a thick, suffocating blanket. Wade Wilson was driving through Lee County, the blue Nissan Altima, now a mobile crime scene. He had spent the morning snuffing out the light of two families, and as he drove, he wasn't looking for a place to hide. He was looking for his next audience. The Deadpool killer had finally completed his first act, and as he adjusted the rearview mirror, he caught a glimpse of that tattooed, stitched smile. For the first time, the mask on his face finally matched the reality of the man beneath it. He was no longer just a drifter with bad ink. He was a butcher who had turned a Monday morning in Cape Coral into a slaughterhouse, leaving a trail of spaghetti and broken dreams in his wake. The silence that followed the morning's violence in Cape Coral was not a peaceful one. It was a heavy, static-filled void that began to vibrate as the sun climbed higher into the white-hot Florida sky. While the humidity rose from the asphalt in shimmering waves, the first ripples of a community-wide panic were starting to form. At Christine Melton's home, the blue Nissan Altima was conspicuously absent from the driveway. To a casual passerby, it looked like a typical Monday morning. But inside the cool, darkened walls of the residence, time had stopped. The search didn't begin with a siren. It began with the persistent, unanswered ringing of a telephone. Christine's friends and colleagues were the first to feel the chill. She was a woman of habit and connection, and when the hours began to slip past the start of the workday without a word from her, the concern shifted from annoyance to a deep, gut-level dread. A welfare check was requested, a standard procedure that usually ends with an embarrassed resident or a simple misunderstanding. But when the Cape Coral police officers arrived at the small, well-kept home, they found the front door locked and the interior swallowed by an unsettling stillness. When the authorities finally breached the threshold, the smell of the house hit them first, a mixture of cold, circulated air and the faint, sweet scent of something ending. They moved through the living room, noting the lack of a struggle. It looked like a home that had been lived in just hours before. Then, they reached the bedroom. The discovery of Christine Melton's body was a moment that would haunt the responding officers for years. She lay where she had been strangled, a stark, brutal contrast to the soft bedding and the quiet domesticity of her room. There was no signs of a break-in, no drawers rifled through for jewelry. This was not a robbery, this was an execution of the spirit. As the crime scene tape began to flutter in the salty breeze outside Christine's house, a second mystery was unfolding only a few miles away. At the Moose Lodge, the staff were looking at the entrance with growing confusion. Diane Ruiz was the reliable heartbeat of their team, a woman who walked to work through the heat because she refused to let her family down. But as the lunch rush approached, her station remained empty. Her family began to call. Her friends began to search the route she usually took along Pine Island Road. She had vanished, seemingly swallowed by the flat, palmetto-choked landscape of Lee County. The search for Diane Ruiz was a desperate, scorched earth effort. Detectives and volunteers fanned out across the undeveloped lots and the thickets of Brazilian pepper trees. The heat was punishing, the temperature soaring into the high 80s, making every step through the brush a physical battle. Information was scarce. Witnesses reported seeing a blue car, a Nissan, driving erratically in the area. But in a city defined by its sprawl and its thousands of similar vehicles, it was a needle in a haystack of chrome and glass. The void was the period of 48 hours where the police were working two seemingly unrelated cases. They had a murder in a bedroom and a missing person on a sidewalk. The bridge between these two tragedies was a name that had not yet been linked to the blood on the ground: Wade Wilson. While the search parties were scouring the woods for any sign of Diane's clothing or a discarded cell phone, Wade was still moving. He was navigating the county like a predator who had found a second wind. Surveillance footage from local businesses began to trickle into the precinct. In the grainy, low-resolution world of security cameras, a figure began to emerge. A man of immense stature. A man whose face was a blur of dark markings. The reports of a tall, tattooed man in a blue Nissan began to gain traction. The community, already on edge from the news of Christine's death, began to pull their children inside. The rumors were spreading faster than the official reports. There was a monster in a blue car, a man with a Deadpool name and a devil's face, and he was somewhere in the labyrinth of Cape Coral's canals. The frustration of the lead investigators was palpable. They were dealing with a man who had no permanent residence, no digital footprint that stayed in one place long enough to track. Wade was living in the spaces between the system, a drifter who had turned his invisibility into a weapon. The search for Diane took on a grim, resigned tone. The golden hour for finding a missing person alive had long since passed. The focus shifted from a rescue to a recovery. Every time a vulture circled over a vacant lot, the search teams held their breath. Every time a piece of trash caught the wind, hearts skipped a beat. The search was not just for the victims, it was for the logic behind the madness. Detectives were baffled by the lack of a clear motive. They were looking for a why in a case that seemed to be defined by "because I could." The social echo in Lee County was one of profound vulnerability. If a woman wasn't safe in her own bed, and a woman wasn't safe walking to work in broad daylight, where was the line of protection? The Deadpool moniker began to appear in the local media, a catchy pop culture label for a man who was proving to be a very real, very lethal threat. As the second night fell, the search for Diane Ruiz hit a wall of darkness. The woods became impenetrable, the shadows stretching out over the dirt where she had been repeatedly run over by the stolen Nissan. The void was total. Two families were now suspended in a state of agonizing grief and unanswered questions. The man they were looking for was still out there, his tattooed smile likely glowing in the dash lights of the stolen car. waiting for the moment when his own father would finally decide that the blood had to stop. The search was nearing its end, but the horror was only just beginning to be cataloged. The investigation into the disappearance of Diane Ruiz and the murder of Christine Melton did not conclude with a high-speed chase or a brilliant piece of forensic deduction. It ended with the heavy, trembling hand of a father holding a telephone. In Tallahassee, hundreds of miles from the carnage in Cape Coral, Stephen Testaseca sat in the mounting silence of his home. He had spent years watching his son, Wade, drift further into a sea of ink and instability. But nothing could have prepared him for the series of phone calls that began to bridge the distance between his quiet life and the nightmare unfolding in Lee County. When the phone first buzzed, Stephen saw his son's name on the screen. He answered, expecting perhaps another request for money or a rambling account of a minor brush with the law. Instead, he was met with a voice that sounded frighteningly alive, vibrant with a terrifying cold euphoria. Wade began to speak, and as he did, the air in the room seemed to thin. He told his father that he had become a killing machine. He spoke with a detachment that was more jarring than rage, explaining that he had decided to eliminate the people who crossed his path. He wasn't seeking forgiveness. He was reporting his achievements to the man who had tried to save him. Stephen listened in paralyzed horror as Wade detailed the events of the previous hours. His son described the moment he took Christine Melton's life in her own bed, telling Stephen that there was no specific reason for it other than the fact that he could. Then, the narrative shifted to the woman on the sidewalk. Wade spoke about Diane Ruiz with a level of cruelty that felt subhuman. He explained how he had lured her into the stolen Nissan, how he had strangled her, and then, the most sickening detail of all, he told his father that he had driven over her body repeatedly. He used the word spaghetti to describe what was left of her, bragging that he had crushed her until she was unrecognizable. As Wade spoke, Stephen realized the boy he had once held was gone, replaced by a creature that found amusement in the wet crunch of human bone. The father was faced with the ultimate, agonizing paradox: the duty of a parent versus the duty of a citizen. He knew that if he hung up, if he remained silent, more blood would inevitably follow. Wade told him he wasn't done yet, that he felt like he was living out a role that was always meant for him. Stephen made his choice, while keeping his son on the line, maintaining a facade of calm through the sheer force of will. He contacted the authorities. The coordination between Stephen and the Cape Coral Police Department was a masterclass in controlled desperation. Detectives in Lee County, who were still processing the grim crime scene at Christine's house, were suddenly handed the key to the entire mystery. They listened to the recordings of the calls, hearing Wade's boastful, flat-toned confession. The search for Diane Ruiz, which had been a blind crawl through the Florida brush, suddenly had a focus. Wade had given his father enough descriptions of the area, the high weeds, the secluded stretch of dirt, that the investigators could finally narrow their search. On October 8th, 2019, the active hunt for Wade Wilson came to a sudden, violent halt. Using the digital breadcrumbs of the stolen Nissan and the information provided by Stephen, the police tracked Wade to a business area in Fort Myers. He was cornered near a spa, standing beside the car that had become a rolling tomb. The arrest was a moment of high-tension stillness. Officers moved in with weapons drawn, their hearts hammering against their vests. Wade didn't resist with the ferocity one might expect from a killing machine. He seemed to simply surrender to the moment, his tattooed smile fixed in place as the handcuffs clicked shut over his massive wrists. But for the detectives, the arrest was only half of the mission. They still had to find Diane. Using the chilling directions Wade had shared with his father, search teams returned to the vacant lots along Pine Island Road. The heat was a physical weight as they pushed through the waist-high grass, the hum of insects, the only sound in the field. Then, they found the tire tracks, deep, jagged ruts in the dry earth where a car had been driven in a frantic, repetitive pattern. In the center of those tracks, they found the remains of Diane Ruiz. The scene was exactly as Wade had described it, a testament to a level of violence that defied typical criminal classification. The forensic recovery was a grueling, hours-long process. the investigators had to document the physical evidence of the vehicular assault, matching the tread patterns of the Nissan's tires to the marks on Diane's body. Every piece of clothing, every fragment of evidence was a silent scream for justice. The spaghetti comment wasn't just a sick boast, it was a forensic reality. The investigation then pivoted to the cold, hard science of the crime scene. Inside the blue Nissan Altima, the technicians found a wealth of biological evidence. DNA from both Christine and Diane was present, a permanent link between the two victims and their killer. The void had been filled with the most damning evidence imaginable. The detectives sat in the interview room with Wade, watching him through the two-way mirror. He sat there with an unsettling calm, occasionally leaning back and adjusting his massive frame, seemingly bored by the gravity of the situation. When they confronted him with the details of his father's cooperation, Wade didn't display the betrayal of a son. He displayed the cold calculations of a predator who had finally been caged. He didn't deny the murders. In fact, he seemed to relish the attention. He was the center of a storm he had created, a man who had finally made the world look at the tattoos he had spent years carving into his skin. The Deadpool killer was now a matter of public record. The social echo in Cape Coral shifted from fear to a profound collective grief. The community began to learn about the victims, not as names in a police report, but as a mother who walked to work and a friend who loved to laugh. The investigation had revealed the how and the who, but the why remained a hollow space. Wade Wilson's father had delivered the monster to the gate, but the damage was already total. As the forensic teams packed up their kits and the crime scene tape was finally taken down, the reality of the trial ahead began to loom. The investigation was over, but the long, slow march toward a 2024 courtroom was just beginning. In June 2024, the 5-year wait for justice reached its peak in a Lee County courtroom. Wade Wilson entered not as a man seeking mercy, but as a spectacle of his own making. The ink had claimed even more of his scalp, and that tattooed, stitched smile remained a permanent, mocking fixture. Throughout the trial, he displayed a chilling, almost hypnotic lack of remorse, leaning back in his chair and even smirking at the cameras. The defense attempted to frame him as a broken machine, bringing in experts who spoke of significant brain damage and a cocktail of mental health struggles. They argued the monster was a product of a fractured biology. But the prosecution dismantled the narrative with the weight of his own words, the recorded calls where he bragged of his achievements. The jury wasn't moved by talk of damaged lobes. They were moved by the image of a woman run over until she was spaghetti. The verdict was final. The jury recommended death for both murders. Wade listened with a hollow stare, proving his malice was undeniable. The cameras have turned away, and the ink-stained spectacle of the Deadpool killer is finally fading into the sterile white of death row. But in the quiet canals of Cape Coral, the names that matter still echo. Christine Melton, a woman of warmth and laughter. Diane Ruiz, a mother who never stopped walking for her family. They are the reality. Wade Wilson is merely the hollow void that tried to swallow them. Justice is a slow, cold process. But for two families, the sun is finally beginning to set on the monster. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.